Hey there, we are Rob and Joanna Tigan. Welcome back to the Growing Home Together podcast. We've been married for over 30 years and we've parented our 5 kids through all the ages and stages. We're excited to share our passion for caring for the soul of your family with you. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Thank you so much, friends, for joining us at the Growing Home Together podcast today. You know, a number of years ago, our kids were excited because a snowstorm gave them a snow day off of school. And one of our daughters was invited to go sledding with a friend. But what should have been a fun memory became really scary because she had a sledding accident that put her in the hospital. And she suffered through a surgery and weeks at home in a wheelchair. And then when she did go back to school, she was pushed out of her friend group by a bully who made the rest of her school year lonely and miserable. And, you know, these things affected her on every level. And she just wasn't the same confident and happy-hearted girl that we knew before the accident.
Right. And I think it's no secret that traumatic events can have a profound impact on our kids' lives. And chances are, even if our kids in our house haven't suffered trauma, they have friends or classmates or neighbors who carry those wounds from the past. For those of us who want to serve and love the kids in our lives and understand trauma, it can make a big difference.
Right. And that's why we're so glad to welcome today's guest, Jayne Schooler, to the show today. Jayne is the author and co-author of many books, including Caring for Kids from Hard Places. She's an expert in child welfare. She's an adoptive parent, and she has brought trauma-informed training worldwide to help adults to care for kids in pain. Thank you so much, Jayne, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Rob and Joanna, for asking me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So can you share a little bit about your background and what led you to write this book before we get into it?
Well, I'd love to. Years and years and years ago, we were living in Branson, Missouri, and David was a pastor. And there was a family in that church that they were foster parents caring for 5 teenage boys. And the mom was in a car accident, so they had to quit foster care. And Jeff, who was 14 at the time, asked us if we would become his foster parent. We didn't have a clue what that meant. It was never on our radar. There was no training at that time. I didn't know another foster parent, but Jeff moved in, and we learned quickly what we didn't know. And that journey continued on, and we moved to Ohio and still as foster parents and fostered about 8 kids before we adopted Ray at 16. It's kind of crazy to say I have a son 57, but when I say he was adopted at 16, I think, okay, that works. All along our journey, my heart has been adoptive parents and foster parents need equipped the very best way that they can. And so that led to a series of books I had the privilege of writing or co-authoring. I realized one afternoon, I came home from church and I talked to my husband about it. I had subbed in children's church, and there was 2 little boys that came in, and I didn't have words for them now. I do now. They were completely dysregulated, and they were in the class maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And the Sunday school teacher kicked them out and told them to sit in the hall. They were 8 and 9 years old. And I left thinking we've got to be able to do better with kids like that, because I later learned that those kids had been witness to domestic violence at 2:00 the morning of that Sunday, but they got up and came for church anyway. That began my journey in not only how can we equip foster and adoptive parents in better ways to understand trauma, but how can we equip churches and nonprofits to understand what is going on with the children, teens, and the last 2 chapters in this book are about adults who are sitting in our congregation with a history of unresolved trauma. So this book came out of an incredible need that I saw.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you know, I think we hear the word trauma so much these days. So can you give us kind of a good definition so we're all on the same page as we get moving forward?
There's lots of different definitions, but I share this definition that there is a perception that event that is happening is life-threatening. And again, it goes down to the perception of neglect is an incredible trauma for a kid because there's totally unpredictable care. That is a perception that my life isn't safe. So that is kind of the working definition that I work with, a perception of a life event that is life-threatening.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you've already alluded to it, but in your book, you really talk about how those traumatic events are not just something that a child is trying to process as a child, but it can affect them long into their adulthood. So can you explain to us how that works?
Absolutely. There's a number of books that are additionally helpful. There's one book called The Body Keeps the Score. And if we don't deal with what happened to us, whether it was, and it's hard words, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, that creates in our system toxic chemicals that affect our brain, our body, our biology, and our behavior and our belief system. Dr. Karen Purvis of Trust-Based Relational Intervention calls it the 5 Bs. And that carries on into our adulthood because there are changes in the brain, and the chemicals that impact that carry us into adulthood. So that's what we're looking at, is the long-term impact of what we call CUTS, chronic, unpredictable, toxic stress. And that came from a book. The author's name is Dr. Nakasawa, and the book is called Childhood Disrupted. But it talks about this chronic, unpredictable, toxic stress that adults with unresolved trauma carry into their life.
Okay, that's a really helpful explanation. Thank you. Yeah, I had mentioned at the beginning that our daughter had that traumatic accident, and then it ended up kind of being a protracted season of difficulty for her, and how we noticed that in a lot of her behaviors, and things like she didn't want to move her body because she was afraid she would injure herself again, or she was, it affected the way that she engaged herself socially and those kind of things. And I know also as an adoptive parent, we recognize that so many kids who come out of the foster system have gone through traumatic stress and have all kinds of behaviors that maybe the population at large might not be able to recognize as trauma connected. So what kind of behaviors are clues that a child has suffered trauma?
Well, if I could back up, Joanna, and mention there's the kind of the levels of trauma, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Your daughter experienced what they call an acute trauma. That is a one-time event. There was probably the perception that her life was threatened by that event. It was probably very scary, very traumatic. And what researchers say is how important it is for us to process an acute event within 24 to 48 hours and sitting down. And I always wondered why they sent counselors into school so quickly if there's been sadly a shooting or something. And I said, that's too soon. The kids aren't ready to talk. The point is they need to talk. What happened? Did you know the student that was injured or hurt? That acute trauma that your daughter experienced was something, if that happens, you need to process. The trauma that we're looking at with our kids is called complex developmental trauma. And what we mean by that is what happened to this child in the first 5 years, because that has the greatest impact on the development of the child going forward. A lot of the kids that we serve can be as much as a half their chronological age socially and emotionally. So when we go down to behaviors, there's a wide range of behavior that could happen. There are some very important key ones that families experience. One of them is manipulation. Our kids have learned that the way to survive, and these are all considered survival behaviors, manipulation, lying would come under that. And we could have a long discussion about lying with our kids. I think I've heard it in every language of countries I've been into, number one complaint. So manipulation is a big one. Triangulation, that is, they're able to get the parents against each other or the parents against the school counselor or teacher. And why those two are discussing what's going on, the youngsters say, well, I got them busy doing their stuff. I don't have to worry about what's wrong with me. A third one is control. Our kids can, and this can go into adulthood. They've had no control over what happened to them, but they try to control other things, even as much as what color socks I'm going to wear, or eating as an area of control. Then there could be aggressive behavior that comes out in all sorts of ways toward themselves or toward others. And the last one is violence. And we have kids that are violent, that families. I just talked to a grandmother of a violent child last week at a conference, and their family has for years tried to make sure they're hiding all their knives. And isn't that awful that you have to think about that? Mm-hmm. And one evening, they forgot to put a knife away. And the little girl came to their door with that knife, threatening them. They said, we forgot to put the knife away, and that kicked her off. So those are kind of wide range overview of the type of behaviors. There's lots of things that come under each one of those categories.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful and makes it tangible for us. So thank you for that. So you talked about the kiddos who were in their Sunday school class and had been removed by the teacher because their behaviors were so difficult. How can a teacher like that, who's kind of thrown into that situation, how did they learn to see past the behavior to what's going on inside those kids?
If it's okay, I'm going to tell you a real quick story. The story is in the book. It was one of the most profound experiences that I had to watch how God can work in 1 hour. We were at a church in Greenville. I never remember North Carolina or South Carolina, but we were at this church and we were asked to present 1 hour on trauma-informed ministry to this group of Sunday school teachers and children's ministers. And 1 hour, what can we say in 1 hour? Well, we got there and we were beginning to present. And I noticed in the back of the room, this one teacher was texting. And I thought, oh, he's bored. He had to be here. So he's texting. Well, I was wrong. At the end of the class, he came up and he said, my name is Ryan. And I want to tell you, this 1 hour changed my life. And I thought, oh, that's awesome. But tell me how. Tell us how. And he said, I have a little boy. Matthew is 9 years old. And I'm always glad the Sundays he doesn't come because he's very chaotic and we have to put him in the hall after 10 or 15 minutes. And I have learned in this 1 hour that Matt does not need me to push him out and disconnect with him. He needs me to connect with him. So I know this little fella loves football. So if he's here today, I'm going to take him out and we're going to throw the football together. If he starts getting dysregulated, he said, that's a new word for me, dysregulated. Instead of disconnecting, I'm going to connect. And he said, I was on the phone texting my wife to bring the football. So long answer to that question, what can Sunday school teachers do? I think they need to be trained on how to deal with difficult behaviors. My experience is that most Sunday school and children's minister staff are not trained and they don't know what to do with these kids. And so if you're in a church a large church, you have a number for your kid or you have a pager for your kid, you're the one that gets the pager to come and get your youngster. Every Sunday you have to leave and come and get him or her. So I think the key, Joanne, is to set up a training and ongoing training. It's not just a one-time event, but training and support for Sunday school staff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we should make sure that your book gets on the shelf at every church library, huh?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking that feels very relatable to me because even in the school setting, our adopted son has gone to a variety of schools as he's grown up, public, private, you name it. And the schools that were actively trauma informed and took those steps to see past behavior just loved our son so well. And we watched him thrive and grow and overcome. And it was just really beautiful. And then when that awareness wasn't provided to him, how much he struggled. It is powerful when all the adults in a child's life can really look at that child with understanding the beautiful things that can happen.
It's been a learning curve for us too, because in our own foster care and adoption experience, I think we grew up in the 80s in the church setting, and it was always like the cause and effect, right? Like the behavior, right. What's the consequence? And, we've learned on our journey, you have to think broader than that. And you miss so many things when you just go right to the behavior piece of it.
Yeah, it should be behavior. What is the need? There's a phrase that Dr. Purvis used for years and years, and that behavior is the language of children who've lost their voice. And my husband, David, shortened that to say behavior is vocabulary for children or adults. Their behavior is telling us something. There's always meaning behind that, always, for all of us. And I think when we change our thinking from behavior to consequence to behavior to need, and then you consider the need and how you can meet that need in a trauma-informed way, it makes the kids begin to feel safe. That's why your son flourished in those safe environments.
Yeah, you just miss a lot when you just look at the behavior and don't look beyond it. Because some of the things you mentioned, they can be, you think, man, this kid's so controlling, or man, this kid's so, you listed some things. To take a pause and say, probably the greater the behavior, maybe the bigger heart issues we need to address here.
Exactly. Yeah.
You name 2 words in your book that are essential for each person at any age. So one is attachment and one is orientation. So can you explain those for us a little bit?
Yeah. The way we were created, God created us for connection. He created us for attachment. And in a securely attached youngster, they learn all sorts of skills for life that they need. If that attachment doesn't happen, which when our kids, a large part of them come into foster care, they have not experienced that healthy attachment. There's been other attachment styles they've gone through, so they don't know how to connect well. And so attachment is our primary need. And my attachment figure as a child should be my parents, who are going to tell me how to live, show me how to live. That's the orientation. And I like to use the example when we went overseas, my attachment figure was the person who met us at the airport, our translator. That was my attachment figure. And she immediately began to orient us to the culture of that country that we are in. Like, for example, she told me right away, don't ever stick your hand out to shake hands with a man in a country. They will not shake your hand. In fact, if you're with David, they won't even notice you. So attachment is that person that makes us feel safe and comfortable and who can lead us and guide us through our life.
That's a helpful way of looking at it. When I think about my role as a parent, I think about all the times from the very beginning that I've kind of had to build bridges for my kids between what they need and who can meet it. And you have just such a great way of talking about that in your book. Can you kind of flesh out for us what you meant by describing this middle circle for a child?
Oh, that is so profound. And it was David's. God gave that to him. But if you think of a bottom circle, here you have a child that's been through cuts or complex trauma. He's very angry and frustrated and disconnected. And then you jump to the top of what will become 3 circles, put in another circle a lot higher on leaving room. And that's the resources that child's need, but there's no one connecting him to those resources. So that's where the middle circle comes in. That middle circle person can be adoptive parents, obviously. It could be school teachers. It could be coaches. But it's that person who gets involved in a child's life, becomes perhaps a mentor. Again, it could be foster parents. It's that middle circle who shows up. Without that middle circle, that child is left disconnected from the needs being met in his life. David always would go on to say, this is what God set up, that here we are down lost in our sin. God is up here, but there was no way to connect us to God. Jesus came as our middle circle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For the caregiver who is trying to become that middle circle for a child who is really standing in the gap for them and wanting that child to get their needs met, sometimes they can grow weary, right? So what is your advice to help them stay in a place of strength and stability while they're serving their child that way?
That's a great question, because the majority, if I'm training foster parents or adoptive parents, I ask them to give themselves a grade on self-care or wellness. Self-care's word is kind of transitioning. Words always transition to wellness, and they usually give themselves a D or F. They don't take care of themselves. And they say we don't have time. And we do have time. if we choose to do it intentionally. So number one, I think they have to recognize the need to work with their own issues in their life. And if they haven't, get with a trusted friend or a counselor. If you have a history of trauma and you're a foster parent or adopted parent, you need to tap into your own stuff and become very self-aware of what is propelling you as a parent, your responses to your kiddos. I think another way to take care of yourself is to become part of an adoption group, either online or if you can in person. Again, we were created for connection. And I believe that resilience in adoptive families comes from connection to one another. And thirdly, don't look at self-care as something that's selfish. It's not. It's taking care of the gift God gave you, and that was your life, and we need to take care of it. If we're pouring from an empty cup, it doesn't do any good. And there are courses on self-care and wellness, reading about it. A great book, another great book for this whole area is called Sacred Rest. It addresses the 7 areas of rest that are needed. And it would be a great adoptive parent support group book to read together, or a book club book to read together. It's a great resource.
Yeah. Oh, that resonates so much with me. I know a couple years ago, it was one of those God created friendships where we found each other online and discovered we lived probably a couple miles apart the whole time.
Oh my, good.
And
that's awesome.
I know. And she's just a few years down the road in her parenting journey than we are. And so being able to just share life experiences and, this is what my child is having to go through or deal with. And she's like, oh, I remember when my kid was in that season. And she kind of normalizes some things for me. It brings them down to size. You realize, wow, this is actually shouldn't be a surprise. And the language that she learned to use, that was her best way of kind of connecting with her kid in those seasons. And it has been pivotal. So you're right. The power of relationship to walk with us can make all the difference.
And Joanna, my experience is you don't have to finish sentences with other foster adopted parents. They know what you're going to say. And
that's true.
So you want me to fill in that blank? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yep.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's true. And, I appreciate your book because it's so much practical, helpful information and a lot of great stories that you can connect with and relate to. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how, as parents, growing in our understanding of trauma can help us create a home that feels safe for our children. And I'm thinking not only, like you said, a lot of times if you're adoptive, foster care, you don't have to go too far to hear those words, trauma and some of these different things. And that you need to maybe research it more. But I'm thinking even in homes where maybe that's not the case, but we're all impacted with trauma on some level. And like you said, this is showing up in our churches, it's showing up in our schools. And so we all need to be informed. So how can that help us create a feeling of safety for our kids, even in our own homes?
Well, the whole concept of felt safety is the bedrock of trauma-informed care. Our kids, whether they're born to us or they come to us through foster care or adoption, they need to feel safe in our home. Felt safety can come across in so many different ways. One of the ways is that we understand that our tone of voice is critical to felt safety. Our body language, I forget the percentage of body language, but particularly our kids are hypervigilant with body language, and it can seem threatening to them, although you don't mean it to be threatening. But giving kids a voice is another aspect of felt safety. I have a voice here. People are going to listen to me. They're going to allow my emotions here, no matter how ugly they are right now. But I'm safe enough that no one's going to come back at me because I feel this way. There was an adoptive dad I talked to a number of years ago, and his son had a chronic lying problem, which is not uncharacteristic of a lot of our kids. It's a survival thing. But before he had entered into a conversation where he was going to have to talk about behavior, he would always say, son, he'd say 2 things. Son, I love you and you're not in trouble, but we need to have a conversation. Just setting that stage for him, his son gradually over time, they saw less and less of the lying. It didn't go away completely, but less and less. So felt safety is critically important.
That is a good word on that. And we were hoping to build that up farther. We know full well at our house that traditional discipline methods don't always work. I mean, Rob mentioned that, where you think, you reward the good and there's negative consequences for the bad, and then your kid's behavior will fall right in line. And it's just not true.
No, it's not true.
No,
it's not true.
So what would your suggestions be when your child has a behavior like the lying, or maybe they're stealing, or maybe they can't keep their temper in line, or they break things, or whatever it might be? What are some strategies for a parent to help move that child toward making a different behavior choice?
One of the strategies, I think, is number one, for parents to understand the difference between what we call a tantrum and a meltdown. Mm-hmm. And they could say, my kid is 10 years old and he's still having tantrums. No, I would guess that is a meltdown. A tantrum is an effort to get something you want and is somewhat responsive to what you want to do. A meltdown is emotional, overwhelming emotional or physical or sensory issue. And the kid goes from 0 to 100 in flat. And if parents recognize that is a meltdown and learn the strategies that help that kid the best, one of them is generally saying nothing and just sitting on the floor for a while until that youngster calms down. Then there's some proactive strategies you can do. In fact, I'm going to meet with a family next week that the youngster is not surviving schools. He has these meltdowns, and she never heard of self-regulation. She's been an adopted parent. So understanding the difference between tantrum and meltdown is one thing. Another reason is to look at what might be causing that behavioral outburst other than a meltdown. And one thing our kids have a great deal of trouble handling, not all of them, is that, Joanne, is that transitions. And there's their brain, there's a whole term called executive function. It's a very clinical term, but just to kind of summarize, our kids sometimes have trouble with working memory. They don't remember what they're supposed to do. They have trouble with self-regulation, and they have trouble with what they call cognitive flexibility or handling transitions. And sometimes a parent has a kid with a meltdown because they said, okay, it's time to go to bed. Well, let's give that, and the kid has a meltdown. Let's do this in transitions in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes. We're going to turn off the TV, and our kids can better do that. It's just learning strategies to help from kicking our kids off.
That's really helpful. I know something that we kind of clued in on over the last year or two is one of my son's anxiety responses, especially to, like, say, a really challenging homework assignment where he's feeling time pressure or he's not confident he can be successful. He'll just sort of freeze. And it used to look like, I don't want to do my homework, so I'm just not going to do it. And finally we figured out, no, he's actually just kind of stuck. And so rather than bearing down, like, well, if you don't get after it, you're not going to get to play your video game later or whatever, and adding to the anxiety, coming alongside to be reassuring and take off the time pressure. And like, hey, if you want me to just sit by you while you work, we're totally here. It's all fine, has helped him kind of break free and be able to start. On the surface, it looked like he was just being non-compliant. So it wasn't even a discipline issue at all. I think that's what I'm hearing you say. We turn things into discipline issues that aren't. They're just your child trying to cope with something that they're not able to cope with.
Actually, and you can never discipline a child in a meltdown. And parents, if they don't recognize the difference, that's where they can get in a lot of trouble. They will send them to their rooms or all sorts of things. Our kids, a lot of them don't understand cause and effect. That comes from early life harm and early life neglect. So if you say, okay, if you don't get your homework done, you're not going to ride your bike, they can't make that cause and effect. It just makes sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is just a side note, but I always think that when I'd go to Disney World and stuff, and I'd see kids having meltdowns, and the parents like going, trying to calm them down, and I'm like, okay, where they're in this overly stimulating situation. They've been probably eating like cotton candy all day and eating all these crazy foods. The park's closing. It's 3 hours past their bedtime, and I'm looking at this, and then the parents are getting mad that they're melting down. And I'm like, this is a perfect recipe for,
I want to have a meltdown in that situation.
Yeah, I would too. And Rob, another one is Chuck E. Cheese's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was created by a man who wanted to get back at parents.
Yeah. Or had his own level of trauma or something.
He had his own level. I'm going to traumatize everybody else. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The question I want to ask next is, what advice would you give to parents who are trying to communicate their children's needs to others? So maybe they're, putting their kids into a Sunday school class where they're not trauma informed, or they're putting, they're in a school with a teacher that's not trauma informed, or whatever situation, even visiting a friend for a play date or something. How can the parent communicate the child's needs to those others in their life that maybe don't understand some of those things?
Right. And that's a great question, because oftentimes adoptive parents tell too much of their child's story, even to the school teachers. And I used to be a school teacher, so I know what the teacher lounge can be like. And I'm not saying it's like that, but oftentimes a kid will get a reputation that follows them all the way through. My advice is that they tell a school teacher, a Sunday school teacher, whomever is caring for this child, what he's going to need in those moments. And so you might say, my son has a sensory issue around noise, so he's going to need to wear his earphones in class. My son has meltdowns over doing any coloring projects. So maybe if someone can work with him because he doesn't have fine motor skills. Just telling that person what they need. In a classroom, putting a child that's hypervigilant in the middle of the classroom is asking for this kid to be spinning around all day, at least in his mind, watching the environment around him. But if you put him at the front of the room in the corner with his back to the wall, he only has half the room to pay attention to. So my son would need to sit up in the front of the classroom. You don't need to go into a lot of detail. Why? Because that's a child's story. And once you tell one person, it's gone. It can go. So telling them what they need in the moment. It may be, don't give this kid a lot of sugary snacks. It just doesn't go well. So those kind of things, Rob.
That's good. That's helpful.
So I know, woven all through your book and really every message that you have to share, you make a very strong connection between our relationship with the Lord and our relationship with the children in our lives. So how has your faith informed your work with kids in a specific way?
Very specifically, I would say, as David and I walked through this project together, and we've been in ministry for almost 50 years, but the whole concept of grace before truth. Jesus gives grace to me before he speaks truth. In other words, he connects with me with grace, and then he will speak the truth, whatever the consequences or needs are there. So I think the whole concept of grace before truth has really helped me as I've looked at kids, we've looked at parents, friends, giving more grace, I think, than I used to.
That's beautiful. That grace idea in mind, I think as parents, it can be really hard to give ourselves grace because we're having to learn how to be trauma informed on the job. And so, I mean, my son is a teenager. I'm not the same mom now that I was when he was 6 or when he was 3. And so you can look back and carry a lot of regrets, and you might even wonder, did I figure it out too late? Have I blown this thing? So yes, what would be your encouragement to parents who are feeling some discouragement or regret?
I think every parent, David actually apologized to my daughter when she was in her 20s for the punitive parent he had been. He realized a lot of his parenting was out of fear. He ministered, you got to make sure your kid's perfect. But anyway, I read a Facebook post that I thought was awesome. And it said, forgive yourself for the things you did not know until you knew them. And that makes a whole lot of sense to me. That we can't be beating ourselves up for things we didn't know. We try our best with what we know. And so I've learned to forgive myself for the things I didn't know before I knew them. And I hope my grandparenting is a lot different than it would have been, at least on the last two, as we were learning all this stuff. Mike is 26 almost. So we're in the early stages of learning stuff when he was one. But so I think that extending yourself grace, don't allow anybody to speak into your life. And I tell Rob and Joanne, I tell adoptive parents, be careful who you share your hurt and pain with, because if they're not in this community, they're going to say things that could be hurtful. Like, why did you send him back? He was only adopted. Or you asked for this. So be very careful who you share your stories with and your needs.
Yeah. And I think that's a good word too, just for those listening who maybe know, as you were talking about, just kind of giving grace for where you were at and what you didn't know, because I've been telling Joanna lately, like, I wish I could go back and parent with grandparenting eyes, because, as a grandparent, you're just, so much of that stress of the parent piece is off. And you just love and enjoy. But that's something that I think we can give our kids, is support them, because they are in that stressful period. They are in that learning period. And so we can come alongside them and encourage them. And so to think, well, maybe I'm not, I tune out some of this because I'm not in a situation where I'm caring for an adoptive or a foster kid, or my kid's not in a heavy trauma situation or whatever, but can you come alongside somebody? Can you learn for somebody else so you can support them and offer them the grace that they can't give themselves right now, and that kind of thing?
Awesome. Yes.
You've given us some great encouragement today and just some great understanding of how we can support and understand trauma better. So I would love it if you wouldn't mind saying a prayer for those listening today, either who may be in the throes of a child in trauma situation, or that's really impacting their family, or they're wondering how they can help and support in their church or their neighbors or whatever. Could you pray for our listeners today?
I'd be honored. Lord, Father God, people that are listening today have stepped up to be that middle circle in the lives of their very hurt and wounded children. They themselves are struggling. So we speak to the heart and mind of foster and adoptive parents who are listening, Lord, that you will give them wisdom beyond themselves. You'll give them sensitivity beyond themselves. Give them what they need to parent the children that you placed in their lives. None of this is by accident, Jesus. You have your hand on them. So we anticipate hearing back, God, the amazing things you've done, because they're releasing the power of the Holy Spirit in their lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
How can people that want to get a hold of this book and understand more of the resources you might have available for those who want to know more about trauma, how can they get a hold of you online to get this resource?
Well, that's very easy. We have a website. It's called Schooler Institute. There's an interesting story behind that. We don't have time to share that, but SchoolerInstitute.org. And the books are available on Amazon. But if anybody listening lives in Southwest Ohio, we're having an amazing conference November 9th. It's called the Most Practical Parenting Conference You've Ever Been to. It's hands-on activities that you can do with your kids all day. They're going to come and play and have fun. So if you're in the Dayton area, check out our website, and probably less than a week, hold the date. In about a few days, the event registration will be up for that conference.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. I know for everyone listening who loves children, they have something wonderful to take away from this. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. It was an incredible honor. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, friends, for joining us today. If you'd like to connect with us, we would love to hear from you over at growinghometogether.com. We have lots of great resources for parents and for your kids and for your marriage. We have prayer books if you want to reach out and pray for your sons and daughters. But we would love to pray for you or hear from you. So at Growing Home Together, we're caring for the soul of your family.
And we're growing home together with you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Growing Home Together podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and found some valuable insights to help you care for the soul of your family. Remember to check out growinghometogether.com for more resources, and stay tuned for our next episode coming your way soon.